Hi, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa, and this week we're going to be talking about neuroethics. We'll look at this in 4 different stages. First, we'll look at the definitions of neuroethics, and then its brief history. Where did it come from? What are its historical roots? And then we'll consider some of the issues, problems, and dilemmas, and the implications they have for legal decisions, for marketing, and for your own personal privacy. And finally, we really want to throw this back at you and ask, what is your role going to be in deciding neuroethics from here on out? A lot of the work here presented is based on Walter Glannon's collection of essential readings on neuroethics, but there's other very influential people, Levy, Ferrin, Eels, many other authors who have really contributed this over the past decade and a half, and it's a fresh new field, and you're invited to delve even further into the information after this presentation. Where did the term come from? This term was coined back in the 1990s by Jean-Pierre Jangot, who used this term when he was at a symposium on biology and ethics at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And this was really the first time there was a separation of the idea of bioethics and neuroethics, which was a very important schism because it forced a lot of people in the field to consider the great differences between just using bioethics as a guide and the special needs of neuroethics, especially because it involved the brain, a very different consideration from times past. The first big meeting on this took place in 2002, very recently. 150 experts from the US, Canada, and the UK met in San Francisco, and they were pushed to do so because they felt there was an urgent need to establish parameters in neuroethics. And they thought if they didn't do this soon, that it would be perilous for humanity, mainly due to the implications that were beginning to arise out of the manipulation of brain imaging or the increasingly common use of drugs to help emotional states, for example, like depression. So the real push for defining neuroethics came from technology. Advances in technology and neuroimaging and in drugs really made a significant mass of people sit up and realize, that technology was now able to manipulate the human mind with almost an invasive quality. And this meant that for the first time there was a real breach of privacy of the human mind. What was going on between your ears was not just your own. Other people could determine whether or not you were lying, for example, or your brain looked like it was set up in a way that looked very similar to other people who had dyslexic brains or brains that had ADHD, or that you were prone for schizophrenia. These types of things had not been exposed to before because technology just hadn't been there. But for the first time then, we realized that something as intimate as your own personal thoughts, what defined you, your own level of consciousness, could be seen by others. And this was pushed even further by the use of nootropic drugs, in which people who were average, normal, who didn't have any problems, were taking cognitive enhancers, things that would actually push the limits of their memory. But without any rules. People really didn't understand, how do we regulate this? Is this wrong? And can we, as a society, get together and set aside some parameters of what would be acceptable or not? This meant that information was reaching the popular press, but also was sneaking into our entertainment, the Minority Report or Limitless or the series Gattaca. What was once considered terribly science fiction was now so close to being reality. And many elements in these movies or TV shows were actually real and could be experienced by the viewer. So all of this meant that not only was a small group of neuroscientists beginning to become concerned about this, but this was being pushed into the public realm, and individuals were asking themselves, what are the limits? Who is regulating these types of decisions to manipulate or change the brain based on chemical enhancement or electrical changes? So neuroethics has many parent or fields. There are many umbrella fields that compose elements of neuroethics, including what has existed for thousands of years, looking at ethics, normative ethics, philosophy of mind, law, but then also sneaking now into the social sciences, anthropology, economics, but really being pushed mainly by advances in the empirical brain sciences and new technologies. Some of you might say, well, where is something like marketing or education? Of course, these are the greater umbrella fields, and it is very important to consider, for example, neuromarketing or the influence of neuroethics on educational decisions. But this graph is only meant to give you this broader view of where neuroethics was born from these parent fields. Another way to consider this with a bit more detail, Patricia Churchland has been doing research in this area for many years at UC San Diego, and she breaks down some of these areas. For example, instead of saying social science, she looks at social neuroscience. And this has a lot to do with decision-making planning. These are the types of things that result from these sub-areas, as opposed to looking at great parent fields. So there's many ways of creating graphs related to neuroethics, but the fundamental element for the purposes of this course is that you understand that neuroethics is a new and unique combination of things that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And research on neuroethics is really hot right now. The Wellcome Trust and the Oxford Center for Neuroethics has let the world know that neuroethics is arguably the most rapidly advancing and exciting field of research today. They still consider it a sub-element of biomedical ethics, whereas there are other people who argue that this is actually its own field. But the main reason is because it gets to the essence of humanity. And, how do our brains function, and what does that mean about our mind and our consciousness and our interaction with the rest of the world? We're going to pause here to watch a video by Martha Ferrin, and I'd have to say that she has really not only been one of the great leaders in the field, but she's really, for humanity's sake, she's really pushed the limits of what is neuroethics. What are the bigger questions we all need to be considering?
To start off with, our first presenter is Martha Ferrin. She is the director of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. She's also been instrumental in developing neuroethics at a national level. She will begin by talking about neuroscience more generally and how it's evolved over time and the kind of impact it has been having more recently in our lives more generally. Martha?
Thank you, Anjan. If you look at the history of neuroscience, going back to ancient Egyptian papyruses and up through the 20th century, you can divide pretty much every advance that's been recorded into one of two categories. Either advances in basic science, that is, how does the brain work? A very interesting problem in its own right. And advances in applied science, which have been, through the 20th century, almost entirely medical advances. That is, advances in the diagnosis and treatment of neurological and psychiatric disorders. But interestingly, right around the turn of this century, in the beginning of the 21st century, a new kind of advance has been coming to us out of neuroscience labs. And this new kind of advance has to do with applications of neuroscience to non-medical problems, to problems as diverse as marketing and business, education, law, human resources, personnel, the military, and criminology, a very wide and varied set of non-medical problems for which neuroscience is suddenly offering us helpful new techniques to solve the problems. What all of these problems have in common, despite their very varied manifestations, is that they depend in a crucial way on our ability to understand human behavior. In fact, I go beyond just saying understanding. They depend on the ability to understand, to predict, and to influence or control human behavior. That's what education is. Trying to educate a child or an adult involves giving them new knowledge, helping them behave in new and different and presumably better ways throughout their lives. Criminology, how can we tell who's dangerous, who's likely to commit a crime? How can we influence them to make them less apt to transgress? Marketing, how do we get the consumer to buy our product? In all of these cases, the history of these fields has involved psychology, so marketing specialists have focus groups, they sit people down, show them the product, talk to them about it, to try to find out what the consumer wants. But we know that people don't even know what they want a lot of the time. So marketers have always been on the lookout for ways to tap into a consumer's unconscious desires, that what they truly want and will truly make them buy, as opposed to what they say they like. Neuroscience, this is one field where neuroscience has a lot to tell us. We're learning an increasing amount about the brain circuits that are involved in liking something, in wanting something. Interestingly, those are not the same thing from a neuroscience point of view. And we can, to a certain degree right now, read from from the results of brain imaging studies, we can read a certain amount about what somebody likes and what they're going to want to spend their money on. That's one example amongst several, as I said, ranging from education to warfare, of the ways in which neuroscience gives us a new kind of purchase on understanding human nature and what people want to do and what they're going to do. In addition to these technologies that neuroscience is giving us for making progress in all these different sectors of society, neuroscience is increasingly influencing society in a more, you could almost call it philosophical way. It's giving us a new view of ourselves as physical mechanisms. It's showing us how our personalities, our behavior, our motivations can all be explained in terms of the behavior of neural networks in our heads. This shift in how we view ourselves has implications for many different realms of life as well, just possibly even more important than the technologies that I just mentioned of, for example, imaging somebody to see what they want to buy. So for example, if everything I do is the result of physical processes in my head determining that behavior, and those processes are in turn caused exclusively by a combination of my genes and my lived experience, how can you hold me personally responsible for anything that I do? I can just say, but my brain made me do it. So neuroscience may have some interesting implications for how people think about their responsibility. Another set of issues involves spirituality and religion. A very common, not universal, but certainly very common feature of most religions in the world is the idea that a person is composed of physical substance and an immaterial soul. And yet, as neuroscience progresses in understanding all the different features of humanity in terms of physical processes, that division into mind and body, immaterial soul and body, is also challenged. So there are many different ways in which neuroscience is going to challenge society, both by the new technologies it brings and also by the new ways it gives us of looking at ourselves. And what we're interested in doing here at Penn is not jumping up and down and saying, oh my God, this is dehumanizing, we got to stop this. Nor is it to say, oh boy, these are powerful techniques, we should patent them and get a piece of the action, or neuroscience is going to solve all of society's problems, but rather to kind of steer a middle course, do what academics are good at doing, which is to try to analyze, understand, assess the promise, the peril, and the hype, and try to sort out what's good and foster that for the good of everybody. Thank you.
A great global introduction there with this, cautious optimism, but also skepticism about the field of neuroethics. Dr. Ferrin mentioned this relationship, if I am just what my genes are. This was the big schism that I mentioned to you earlier that Jean-Pierre Changot indicated. Should neuroethics just be considered something, a sub-element of bioethics? And the big argument there is that neuroethics and genetics are different. So the argument is basically that your brain is born partially of this genetic makeup, but it's also the unique experiences in your life that create who you are, yourself, your essence. So the question that's posed here is, do we cease to be who we are when our brains are modified, so our conscious understanding of ourself is differed, as opposed to changes in your genes, which might not change that conscious understanding of your consciousness? This is also different from the greater field of bioethics for another reason. This is a quote from Sapphire's introduction to Glennon's book. Let's face it, one person's liver is pretty much like another's. Our brains, by contrast, give us our intelligence, integrity, curiosity, compassion, and here's the most mysterious one, conscience. So the brain is the organ of individuality. Therefore, it deserves its own field of ethics, according to these authors. So what are some of the technological changes? Way back, in the 40s and 50s, we began experimenting with neuro X-rays, which was sort of considered a bad idea afterwards because you realize you killed off brain cells when you did that. And then we've come to more sophisticated ways of imaging the brain between PET scans, MRIs, EEGs, which have emerged really only over the past years or so. And one of the current triggers for calling for neuroethics has to do with something related to electrical manipulation of the brain and deep brain stimulation, in which you either insert electrodes into the brain and you can change things like symptoms of Parkinson's disease, obsessive compulsive disorders, depression, or people who are in minimally conscious states, they can be revived. Or you can do transcranial stimulation, which doesn't even have to do with electrodes. These things are minimally invasive compared to other things in the past, which has really pushed this discussion about what are the parameters, what should this technology be used for. However, we are called to reflect, and this is Judy Isles' work, which is really important. Neuroimaging is not perfect. It's far from perfect. And every time we have better and better technology, we realize the imperfections even further. Neuroimaging are subject to interpretation. So if you have an experiment, you have somebody in a default mode, then you have them doing an activity and you sort of subtract that, and then we enhance an image. We interpret it to mean something. This is far from a perfect or precise science. So it brings into question how much we should really rely on the technology that we have right now. To look a little bit further into this idea of neurotechnology, neuroimaging, and the cautions that need to be thrown out there, we're going to look at another video by Dr. Aguirre, also from Pennsylvania and part of Dr. Ferra's team.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jeff Aguirre. He is in the Department of Neurology, is an expert in functional neuroimaging. Martha mentioned promise, peril, and hype, and in part I think that's what Dr. Aguirre will talk about. Which is the way in which functional neuroimaging has been used both in the scientific literature and in the lay press, and will guide us to a better understanding of this technique.
Great, thanks, Anjan. Well, so images like these are a great example of the pervasive influence of cognitive neuroscience that Martha was describing before. So pictures of the brain now appear in all sorts of publications that you see both within the scientific literature as well as within the lay press, and are starting to have an influence, as we've heard and will hear, in all sorts of areas outside of simple neuroscience. And so the technology for producing these pictures is now ubiquitous. The methods are very well established. But there remains, however, a problem of interpretation. So this particular image is taken from the op-ed pages of the New York Times, and it was generated when scientists from UCLA joined forces with some business partners and recorded neural activity from voters in the lead up to the primaries of the 2008 election. So they obtained these brain pictures while voters looked at pictures of the different candidates. And then, interpreting the results of a picture like this, came to conclusions like voters felt a sense of conflict when they saw pictures of Hillary Clinton and thus had unresolved feelings regarding her candidacy. Well, the scientific community reacted fairly harshly to this sort of interpretation and this presentation of the work. And this op-ed has been repeatedly held up as an example of the unsupported conclusions that can follow from a very well-made neuroimage. And indeed, in recent months, there's been a bit of a movement towards increased criticism of neuroimaging as a field. So maybe there should be a better way for us to think in general about how to evaluate the claims of neuroimaging studies and separate substantiated from fairly unsubstantiated claims. Well, so I'm going to try and offer a basic guide. So it turns out that neuroimaging studies tend to fall into one of three categories. And for each category, we can identify sort of a central question that lets us figure out whether or not the claims are well established or maybe extend a little bit beyond what can be claimed. So the first type of study uses something called forward inference. So in this experiment, the scientist tries to control the behavior of the subject and isolate a particular mental state to then try and learn which region of the brain is activated in response to that. So the newsworthiness of these studies often derives from the perhaps surprising claim that a fairly complicated behavior or emotion is associated with some discrete area of the brain. So, for example, the claim that there would be a more morality area of the brain, or that we found the piece of brain that's for love. So the potential error here is to declare that a single spot in the brain is for something. The key question to ask is, how did we actually isolate this fairly complicated emotion? How do we try and find that pure essence of love so that we can isolate it and study it in the lab? Well, so one prevalent approach is to try and subtract two different behavioral states. leaving behind the pure, isolated mental or emotional state that's under study. So for example, trying to compare the brain activity that is observed when a subject views pictures of their spouse versus pictures of a good friend. The idea being that the difference between those two conditions would leave behind the state of romantic love. Well, we can imagine that there's a lot of ways that that particular subtraction might fail, that there might be several different behavioral or emotional states that might differ between seeing pictures of your spouse or seeing pictures of a good friend. So this is a fairly crude example, and there certainly are refinements of the technique and much better constructed studies. But it illustrates the core assumption that lies behind these sorts of forward inference studies. One must isolate a particular behavioral state to study it, to then identify a piece of brain that's associated with it. However, most of the neuroimaging studies that have particular social impact these days are of the second kind and could be called a reverse inference study. So in this kind of study, the presence of local brain activity is used now to infer the presence of a particular behavioral or emotional state on the part of the subject. So for example, the brain image that we started out our discussion with is an example of a type of reverse inference study where we try to learn the emotional state of voters when they view pictures of Hillary Clinton and conclude, for example, that because there's activation within the anterior cingulate, that subjects experience a state of conflict. Well, so a similar kind of logic is the basis of many headline-grabbing studies, such as the finding that people with severe grief have a paradoxical feeling of pleasure when they view pictures of departed loved ones, or that hearing a lie evokes the same sorts of sensations as seeing disgusting food. Well, the central assumption that's behind these kinds of studies is that there is a one-to-one link between activity in a particular area of the brain and a particular emotional or behavioral state. And the extent to which then that the conclusion is justified for the study depends upon the strength of that link. So coming back to the Hillary Clinton example, if it's the case that the anterior cingulate could be activated by other sorts of behavioral or emotional states, say memory or emotion or optimism, decision-making, all different mental states that have been identified as activating the anterior cingulate, then who's to say that the particular emotional or behavioral state that subjects feel when they see that picture of Hillary is actually one of conflict? It could be any one of these other states that have been identified. So that really is the core assumption then of reverse inference. How well established is that link? And if we dig beneath the surface, we might find that in some studies it's well established, and other studies no. The final and third type of study is a cutting-edge twist on that reverse inference approach. And instead of looking at just a single area to try and deduce the mental or behavioral state of a subject, a computer is trained to look at multiple areas, multiple regions across the brain, and identify the pattern of brain activity that's associated with a particular state. So this is the basis of a number of studies that fall almost into the category of mind reading. For example, having a computer that can look at the brain activity and determine which of many thousands of pictures a subject is looking at the time, or which word they're thinking of, or even if you're telling the truth. So the key question to ask here is, how generalizable is the result? So the method works by training a computer with a particular set of examples of stimuli, and then trying to see then if the computer can later on guess which example stimulus is being presented at the time. The real question is, can the result of the study generalize beyond the stimuli that were used? So this is particularly important when we think about the example of lie detection. So we might be able to train a computer in a particular experimental paradigm to be able to tell which of a particular playing card you're holding and if you're telling the truth about whether or not you hold the ace of spades. But we're still quite a far way off from trying to determine what actually happened in Vegas that night. So to summarize, although there's a huge variety of different neuroimaging studies that are out there, they can all boil down to really three core types, and those being a forward inference study where we try and control behavior and learn something about where in the brain there's an activation, a reverse inference study where we try and take a look at the location of activity in the brain and learn something about the mental or emotional state of the subject, and then finally that twist on reverse inference, trying to look at the pattern across the entire brain to learn something about a mental state. And for each of those cases, there's a core question that you can ask to try and determine if the claims that are being made extend a little bit beyond what can actually be supported by the data. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
So again, another good example of optimistic skepticism. Let's be very careful with the information that we have and what neuroimaging can really tell us. A lot of this is still up to just an individual's interpretation. And you will find conflicts in the literature where different individuals will conduct similar experiments and find very different things because of their interpretation of the information that's presented. So it's not all black and white. And a neuroimage shouldn't be your proof that something is actually occurring in the brain. And I'd like to offer a special word to teachers. There was research done that showed that teachers were particularly vulnerable to believing things that showed a neuroimage, even if it was incorrectly attributed to the fact that was being shared. So long as you flashed a brain up on the screen, teachers were more likely to believe the information that was delivered at the same time. So we have to be very, very careful. We put a lot of faith into information that comes from neuroimaging, but it's an imperfect art. So what are some of the definitions that we have about neuroethics? Roski's really hit the nail on the head when she said there's two different subfields of neuroethics. One is the ethics of neuroscience, and the other is the neuroscience of ethics. So what does your brain look like on morality, right? So these are two different sub-elements here. What we're going to be focusing on is really the ethics of neuroscience itself. So this is focused on ethical, legal, and the social impact of neuroscience findings and neurotechnology, and the understanding now that we can actually alter human behavior based on changes in electrical or chemical manipulation of the brain. Other definitions, the Stanford Encyclopedia says that neuroethics is an interdisciplinary research area that focuses on ethical issues raised by our increased and constantly improving understanding of the brain and our ability to monitor and influence it, as well as on ethical issues that emerge from our concomitant depending understanding of the biological basis of agency and ethical decision-making. And the International Neuroethics Society says that it's a field that studies the implications of neuroscience for human self-understanding, ethics, and policy. But perhaps one of the better definitions comes out of Glennon's book and from the conference, which cites Sapphire, who says that neuroethics is the examination of what is right and wrong, good and bad, about the treatment of, perfection of, or unwelcome invasion of, and worrisome manipulation of the human brain. So for the purposes of our discussion, I'll let you come to your own conclusions about the perfect definition. However, I'm pretty partial to this last one here. Morals, coming from the Latin root moralis, is really what is right or wrong, whereas ethics has to do with what is good or bad. So not putting such a judgment call, but actually saying, how do we regulate? How do we determine if something is correct or incorrect within our societal structure? So let's have a quick historical review of where neuroethics comes from. Back with the Greeks, back with Galen. Galen was one of the first people to sort of push this. He realized, when we realized that the brain must have something to do with electrical changes, he recommended using eels, for the treatment of severe headaches because of the electrical stimulation that it would cause. But it's posited that one of the first meetings on neuroethics was really by the side of Lake Geneva when Lord Byron and his friend Mary Shelley got together, and they created Frankenstein. And this big idea of is it correct? Is it all right, to use different parts of individuals or to manipulate things like the human brain to create a new being out of that? So, and it's only halfway jokingly that people refer to us as one of the first meetings on neuroethics. Ferrin in the 1880s showed direct electrical stimulation to the brain in a surgical procedure could change behavior. So this is where we began considering introducing electrical apparatus into the brain that would change human behavior. And Penfield is probably one of the most acclaimed neurologists. In the 30s, he used electrodes to stop epileptic seizures. So he would insert and inhibit the communication between areas because he would block certain electrical impulses. In doing this, he actually did some of the first mapping of the human brain of the motor cortex with Rasmussen in 1950. And this is where you get the famous homunculus design of the human brain, of what areas of the sensomotor cortex were physically related to other areas, what was close to the other areas. This is where you get your first psychological hypothesis also of why people have foot fetishes, because your genitalia are really close to your feet, for example. So his mapping sparked a lot of reflection on psychological issues as well. Egos Moniz performed the first psychosurgery, which were really these frontal lobotomies. So some of you saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The idea was basically removing the entire frontal lobe of an individual. And he was given, the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949 for doing this because it basically relieved psychological stress, according to his studies. But in the 50s, after Walter Friedman performed about 3,500 of these in the United States, it was discovered this was really also still kind of imperfect, right? So while it might have relieved some psychological stress in some people, it caused personality changes in others, or it increased seizures in other people, or made them be very apathetic, or had loss of muscle control, or even in some of his cases, death. This is him inserting through the eyeball. This was lobofrontal surgery where you actually entered the brain through the eyes. It was with José Delgado's work in Spain in the 60s and 70s that we began to see how you could manipulate behavior. What would be normal instincts in animals could be stopped based on electrical implants. Delgado began by doing things with monkeys, as you can see below, but he also had this famous experiment, if you have the time to look at the video, where he implanted these electrodes in a bull's head. And he allowed the bull to go charging at him at this fast pace, but he would flip a switch at the last second and the bull would just freeze, would just stop, because it was implanted in his motor cortex and it made his leg movement just stop, right? So he extended this and he implanted electrodes in about 25 different patients because he thought this would be a way to avoid, removing the entire frontal lobe. Let's just insert electrodes in the brain to relieve things like schizophrenia and epilepsy. But he, again, had very mixed results due to the limitations of technology at the time. So the big things that came out of these initial experiments historically was that there was a clear understanding that your brain could be manipulated by changes in electrical impulses. But starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a big push to see, okay, well, what can drugs do in a similar way that might be less invasive? We don't have to do an operation or surgery, but people can just pop a pill. So could that have similar results? So psychotropic drugs intervention began in the 50s, and pharmacology has really grown in terms of experimentation, even beyond what electrical interventions have done over the past 2 decades. So one of the big ideas to look at this stage, so if you paused here in the 90s, when we get up to the 90s, and there was this big pause of saying, okay, before we used to consider surgical intervention using things like electricity or chemical intervention because we had people at risk. We had people with schizophrenia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, or we have people who have depression, ADHD, or things like that. So how can we enhance their quality of life or their memory or their attention spans or their emotional states to get them back up to neutral? Starting in about the 80s, 90s, we began to take this in another direction. What would happen if a normal person who didn't have ADHD, what if they popped some Ritalin? What if they took some pills there to enhance their memory? What would happen to them? So then you get these people, you get results where people are actually perfect SAT scores or having perfect memory or enhanced attention abilities thanks to pharmacological interventions. So this moves us from just saying, let's treat patients at risk to looking at optimal human performance, what is possible. This is what really tips the balance from a lot of people saying, okay, one was to help poor people who were below, a neutral state, an average state. The other is saying, okay, now how do we enhance cognition to a different level? And these are different types of questions. So to explore this a little bit further, we're going to look at another short video.
So for the next presentation, I will be talking. As I mentioned, I'm a practicing neurologist as well. And what I'm going to talk about is the use of pharmacologic enhancements in normal individuals. So these are people that are not actually experiencing a disease. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to start out with the hypothetical patient. So I have my practice over at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. I see patients with various kinds of cognitive disorders. And this hypothetical patient, who's middle-aged, quite well-to-do, walks in. And he comes in because he has problems with his memory. And I talk to him for a while, and it becomes quite clear that the real reason for his memory problems is that he's very stressed. He's going through a divorce right now. And that he's so preoccupied by his internal emotional states that he loses track of things, and that what he really has is some mild symptoms of depression, and this is contributing to his memory problem. This seems fairly straightforward, so I give him an antidepressant, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. He takes this, and after a while he feels quite well. and he's back to his type A personality, doing very well in his profession. So he likes this. In the meantime, his daughter, who now is a freshman at Penn, turns out is not doing quite as well as she had in high school. He gets concerned about this, wants me to see the daughter. The daughter is diagnosed by her high school psychologist before she came to Penn as having attention deficit disorder, but now she's a young adult, so I see her. I prescribe a stimulant, in this case Adderall. She takes it. She tends to do better in her midterms. Her dad is really thrilled at this now. And then he starts to think a little more expansively. He thinks that his son, who's a runner, but he's a pretty good runner, but he's not a state-level runner. And he decides that if his kid could only be slightly better, maybe he'd get into a better school. So he comes to me and says, is there anything you can do? And I point out that there really is no hard data for medications that might help for such a condition. However, there was one study that showed that mountain climbers actually at Mount Everest were studied in the condition in which they were given a medicine called sildenafil, better known as Viagra, and that this actually improved their oxygen carrying capacity within their lungs. So there was a rationale to think this might help a long-distance runner. I suggest trying this. The son is excited about this possibility. He takes the medication, ends up doing well, and now the father is even more thrilled. He is now going to vie for a contract for his business, which is being offered by the royal family in Saudi Arabia. He comes up with the idea that maybe if he learned Arabic, this would give him an edge over other people competing for this position. He wants to know if there's anything I can do to help him learn Arabic more quickly. And I point out that there is some data that amphetamines improve neural plasticity, that if he took amphetamines in combination with taking his crash course in Arabic, that this might actually help. The doses are relatively low. He takes the amphetamines, he learns Arabic. We're not sure if the medicine helped, but he feels as though it has, and he's now excited about this. He leaves for Saudi Arabia. I give him an Ambien to take so that he can sleep through the plane, a medicine called modafinil that gets him alert as soon as he gets off of it. He speaks in Arabic, he wins the contract, comes back, is absolutely delighted. Okay, so that's the scenario, a hypothetical scenario, mind you, but one that is not so implausible. And the question I would ask you as you're listening to this is, what was your reaction to it? Did you think, this is great? How do I sign up for your clinic? Or were there points at which you felt uncomfortable? And what I'd like to suggest is there are several reasons why one might feel uncomfortable. First is an issue of safety. How safe are these drugs? What kind of side effects do they have? How safe are they for chronic long-term use? That's an issue. A second issue is one of distributive justice. Clearly, these medications are available to those that can afford them. How do we deal with this idea, which turns out is rampant in our society if you just think of the kinds of education, nutrition, shelter, safety that people have. But this would add yet another piece to the kind of inequities that exist in our society in which we at least hope things are reasonably fair. A third question that is somewhat difficult to deal with is an issue of character. We have these general ideas in our culture that no pain, no gain, that struggle builds character, that things should be fair in competition. And the question is, if people are using various kinds of medications to manipulate their mood, to improve their cognition, does this somehow rob us of something that is absolutely critical to the development of character? And the fourth issue is one of coercion. If it turned out that these drugs or drugs like these actually help people's cognition, could it be expected of them? Could your boss, for example, demand that you take these medications because, after all, we want our workers to be most productive? Ultimately, I think this kind of use of medications, and I coined the term cosmetic neurology for this, is inevitable. The challenge before us, I think, is how do we manage the onslaught of this kind of use of medications in a way that does the least damage to ourselves individually and to ourselves communally.
So another powerful concept there by Dr. Chatterjee, cosmetic neurology, and where does that take us? So these are big points of reflection for us individually. And this really boils down to this greater idea of who decides. Whose job is it to make that decision of where the parameters are of neuroethics? So the ability to map, monitor, and manipulate the brain raises many, many ethical questions. And it's not clear who should really lead this discussion. Is it for the public, as Roski says in her paper, to have this public debate and we all come to some conclusions? Or should a formal society, for example, all these experts that are in the International Neuroethics Society, is it their job? Or is this something that falls on to policymakers in individual societies? Are these questions that are global for universal consideration, or are they just country specific? Should everybody decide in their own communities how you manage neuroethics? So these are some big things we want to put on the table for you to think about. We want to look at an additional definition of what neuroethics includes and what types of questions are on the table by looking at this next video.
This program is brought to you by the Emory University Center for Ethics.
I went into neuroscience because I wanted to help people, and I wanted to have an impact on society, and I was really, the more deeply I got into my project, the fewer opportunities I felt I had to actually interact in a way that was meaningful for me with society. And that's not to say that I don't think people in the laboratory do meaningful work, but for me, I felt that lack. So I kind of struggled with trying to figure out what directions to move into. And I started reading a lot of literature, and I came upon something that was called neuroethics. And I was like, holy smokes, that's exactly what I want to be doing. And then I dug deeper, and lo and behold, Paul Ruolpe is here, one of the founders of the field of neuroethics. And I just felt like that was a signal that I was on the right path. I struggled with defining neuroethics for a while, as many people do, I think, with ethics, period. And even up until recently, there wasn't a universal neuroethics definition even available by the official International Neuroethics Society. But there is now, and there are two ways that you can define neuroethics. One is how neuroscience and neurotechnologies are informing our value systems, and two is the neuroscience of ethics. So how doing brain imaging of someone doing some moral decision-making exercise. And my project now, my research now fits more into the former definition. I'm interested in how neuroscience informs our definitions of disease and also how we conceptualize treatment. And a lot of times people don't realize that technology often creates the balance of how we define disease. So we used to not think of addiction as actually a medical problem or mental illness, and more and more universally people are understanding that this is not a moral failing, but this actually has a biological basis. That doesn't mean that people aren't culpable for their behaviors. It just helps us understand the disease process a little more and how we should treat those people. And now I focus on something called psychogenic movement disorders. And what it is kind of what it sounds like. It's psychogenic, so its genesis is thought to be from the psyche. So it has a psychological origin that manifests in a movement disorder that mimics other more understood disorders, such as Parkinson's disease or epilepsy, even paralysis. And they're really debilitating. People can be wheelchair bound for their entire life, and there's no treatment and not really a support system. And because we don't really understand the pathology behind the disease, it often leaves the patients in a different social reality for others. So they can't get a diagnosis, they can't get a consistent treatment. There's not even an advocacy group for these patients. And I was really surprised to see the different reactions to something that everyone called psychogenic. And I had never heard that term in the decade that I've been studying movement disorders. And there was a really strong emotional response from people of all over the spectrum of emotions towards this. Some people were very concerned and sympathetic. Some were a little frustrated. There were a lot of different responses. And I came to learn more about these patients and that there's actually a lot of them. So in epilepsy clinics, there's sometimes about a third of the patients, and in movement disorders, it can be 10 to 25%. So I thought it was important to find out first what are physicians doing right now for these patients, and then develop hopefully a consensus where we can advise physicians on healthcare training, healthcare policy, and all realms of this for all relevant stakeholders in this problem. We're looking at neuroscience and how it impacts our ideas about autonomy, identity, and free will, which will have major implications in legal settings, and also will have implications to healthcare policy. And there are also interesting questions being asked about how we should conceptualize and appreciate diversity. So there's a movement going on that I've mentioned before that is called neurodiversity, and it's the idea of how to appreciate and preserve the differences that we see, and so for example, some people in the autism community actually claim that they don't want to be considered to have a disease. They want that to be appreciated, and that the way that they communicate with the world is just as valuable as others, albeit different. There's also one thing that's really exciting about neuroethics too is that there are some key female figures leading the field. So we actually have an opportunity to have a scholarly field led and pioneered by women, which is really powerful. So largely now, most of our ethics are informed by Abrahamic Judeo-Christian traditions, and East Asian philosophical perspectives as well as Buddhist perspectives would look at these problems a little differently. So I think that it's time to engage in that kind of scholarly work, especially as we embark on thinking about these problems globally. And another thing that's going to have a big impact is how neuroscience is defining our humanness, or challenging boundaries of humanness. So now that we're identifying researchers here like Frans de Waal, who have identified traits that have formerly been privileged to humans, such as empathy, in monkeys, and also many people are identifying these traits in a number of animals, we start to wonder how human you need to be considered human. So even at Emory here in our law department, in our law school, you can take classes on animal law. It's one of the most rapidly growing law fields. And so you'll see that in the future we'll be reconsidering ideas of animal personhood, and that is going to be a debate that neuroethics has a huge part in. So lots going on.
So hopefully Dr. Rommelfanger's video expand further this definition that we have of neuroethics. So what are some of the big issues in neuroethics? And according to the International Neuroethics Society, they say that brain privacy is one of these big ideas, one of the big issues here. The use of cognitive enhancement and how that might lead to pharmacological manipulation. Also the use of brain imaging within the criminal justice system. How reliable is that eyewitness? And also the safety of neurotechnology and how does that work. So in this field, you'll see people being exposed to simple stimuli to see how they're reacting to it. But in other cases, you'll see how maybe somebody's brain is intact, whereas the connection to bodily movements isn't. So how can you send a signal from your brain to get a robot to do things for you? But in other spaces, there's this huge expansion of gaming that's occurring. So anticipating the actions or predicting the behavior of an individual in different situations is not only helping gaming, but it's also helping manufacturers, for example, and how they design products in the future. And there's a question, really, should the use of brain stimulation to enhance performance in gaming and recreation, that be prohibited or discouraged or encouraged, or should it be required? Might it be a prerequisite to actual use in products that you have this type of experimentation occur with more frequency? And we find that this is more and more possible as technology is providing for less and less invasive structures. So we introduced in week 2, when we talked about functional neuroanatomy, the ways that you can know the brain. And these days you'll find things as simple as something that looks like a basic headband that can be used to monitor blood flow to certain areas of the brain, which would theoretically indicate that that area of the brain or those particular neural networks are being more stimulated than others. We have these things of neural chip or implants in the brain. We have things, again, this is very similar to the one up here that measures blood flow. You can measure electrical impulses, or you can cause an electrical impulse that might change your behavior as well. So it's really still an area that's so virgin as far as exploration is concerned. There's so many more things to look into, but the questions multiply with each new intervention that's devised. One of the areas that's most easily illustrated by this is the neurobiology of decision making, or this concept of neuromarketing. How is it that initial learning about what people want, need, can be changed into manipulating what people want or need? So in order to explore this a little bit further, we want to look at two very, very short videos about what is neuromarketing, what does this mean, and how is it being used currently in today's business structure.
Hello and welcome to this introductory course in neuromarketing and consumer neuroscience. My name is Thomas Soiger-Ramsøy. I'm the director of the Center for Decision Neuroscience here at the Copenhagen Business School. In this course, we'll talk about different aspects of consumer neuroscience, which means how the brains of consumers drive their choices. We'll talk about attention and consciousness, learning and memory, emotions and feelings, and ultimately how we make up our minds.
Tis the season. Retailers want you in the door, opening your wallet and buying their brands. The question on their minds, what makes one person hand over their hard-earned cash while another hangs on to it?
Anything that we watch, we see, we hear, we listen, we touch, we taste, we smell. Well, finally, it all ends up in the brain. So, if only we could know what persuades us.
This upstart research firm in Berkeley, California is working on an answer. Instead of looking at what happens in the mall, they're looking deep into the consumer's brain.
Neuromarketing is just using science to understand what motivates us and what makes us who we are and what makes us behave in certain ways.
A.K. Pardeep is the founder of Neurofocus, the biggest neuromarketing company of its kind.
Well, how does the brain react to the free part of the free camera phone? Does she get it?
His enthusiasm is obvious and contagious.
All the highs we need, we get in at work every day. The action happens in the brain, and we are as close to it as we possibly can.
This team of neurophysiologists and scientists is working to measure the human brain.
We directly reach into the brain to understand how the consumer feels about your ad and your brand and your product.
So we've got you all hooked up.
First, they invite a pre-screened consumer to the office. The setup is pretty straightforward. The sensors measure electrical impulses via electrodes placed on the scalp at an eye-popping rate of 2,000 times per second. That massive data flow is coupled with this pixel-level eye tracking device and these tabs that will measure changes in the skin's electrical conductance.
Then we let you watch the ad. As you watch the ad, second by second, in fact 2,000 times a second, we look at your attention, your emotional engagement, your memory retention. And from that, we composite a measure of effectiveness second by second by second.
The neurophysiologist watches the brainwave patterns in real time.
Yeah, let's take a look at brainwaves. Excellent.
These squiggly lines provide a millisecond by millisecond printout of how this consumer's reacting to Daily Planet. But this isn't the whole story.
Looking at brain waves is beautiful, but it doesn't tell you much. So what we have done is we have broken it down into the 3 key parameters. Just 3.
Those 3 parameters are attention, emotional engagement, and memory retention. Neuroscientists already know which part of the human brain corresponds to each of those parameters, and from those measures, they infer more information.
What I can see here right now is that you had a really super high attention. We had some things drop out periodically, but all in all, really good promo.
So I can tell you what parts of the ad kind of drove purchase intent. What are the parts of the ad when perhaps you talked about a new feature? The consumer's brain said, oh really? That's novel and new. What are the parts of the ad the consumer really got? And what are the parts of the ad they were confused by? So the idea is to get data as pure as you possibly can.
Pradeep is the first to admit he didn't discover this science.
Did we invent it? Well, hell no. All we did was apply the amazing neuroscience that neuroscientists had developed into the world of marketing.
But no one has done it quite like this before.
Persuasion or purchase intent or view intent we extract as a metric directly at the brain. No one has been able to do that before.
The sensors are, well, more sensitive, and new generation software is specially designed. They actually reverse engineered it.
So what we did, we collected a whole bunch of ads. We analyzed the ones that resulted in sales neurologically. We got the neurological parameters associated with them, see how they clustered. And then what we did, we said, let's reverse engineer the algorithms from the ones that worked and the ones that didn't. So our algorithms that compute purchase intent were derived from marketplace successes and marketplace failures.
Pradeep says it's more science than art.
Based on what we know, we can very comfortably predict that these will result in sales increases or won't.
When it comes time to go shopping, Pradeep is one tough customer.
I ask myself, how many of them stopped and listened to my brain and to my mind talking to them at 2,000 times a second? Because those that bother to listen, those products I will buy.
So slightly scary there maybe, but what did those machines measure? They did eye tracking, where is your eye looking, what calls your attention. They also measured blood flow, and they also measured electrical changes. So all of those things were incorporated into these different techniques. If you look at these are older techniques. These are things that from 2009, 2011. So there's a lot of things that have occurred since then, and they just get more and more sophisticated as the technology gets more and more refined. So what kinds of dilemmas does this pose for us? If we talk about neuroethics, one of the things that was mentioned in a earlier talk by Dr. Chaudhry had to do with the effort that it takes to actually change things. So if we know your brain changed, it stopped being depressed thanks to drugs, as opposed to therapy, for example, are you yourself or are you the results of your drugs? So is your own personal effort in creating behavioral change part of what makes us human? Or can we now just rely on drugs to do that? There's other questions that have to do with the neurobiological basis of emotions, beliefs, memories, mental states, and understanding that those can actually be changed by the drugs that we take. And some of these can be informal. We don't even think about the fact that we wake up in the morning, we have coffee, the foods that we eat, the nutrition that we take into changes our chemical makeup. But then at night, because we're so wired, we need to have that drink to get us down to sleep or take a sedative. All of these things are different from what we consider these formal prescriptive drugs as well, but they are part of your daily life. So have we taken into consideration how what we do to our body changes what our mind is capable of doing? And then other information that gives us pause. If you know that early diagnosis and early prescription of antidepressants, for example, yields to a higher rate of successful intervention than doing this later on or taking time, does this time pressure that we have to respond to individual problems create the pressure to go quickly for the drug instead of taking the time for a deeper analysis, or to maybe scale things up for starting at an intervention that might have to do more with your intake, maybe of basic nutrition or exercise or sleep rates, then maybe scaling up to something psychological before you do something that's an intervention of changing your neurobiological formation through drugs, for example. And this gets to a final question of another newer area of research that has to do with neurobiofeedback. What would happen if you were able to not inject drugs into yourself, but to be much more aware of your body, and using that information, could you actually train yourself to do what a drug might do for you? So if you find yourself slipping on one front or another because you're reminded, you're given neurobiofeedback, biofeedback that your brain is going to understand what your body is needing or reacting to, could you then react to that in a different way? Patricia Churchland has done a lot of research, as I mentioned before in her earlier graphic, and I would like you to see what she considers to be the biggest issues now in neuroethics.
By changing levels of oxytocin, you can change sociality and how individuals interact with others. I'm Pat Churchland. My home institution is the University of California in San Diego. My work is sometimes described as neurophilosophy, and that's because it's at the interface of traditional questions in philosophy, such as what's the nature of consciousness, what's the nature of knowledge, and on the other hand, with neuroscience that is beginning to reveal something about the organization and the function of the physical brain that will help us answer those traditional philosophical questions. One of the questions that I've long been interested in has to do with the nature of decision making and what can we learn from the brain about how decisions are actually made. The most general question has to do with whether or not there are causal antecedents for the decisions that we make. And on that, it looks pretty clearly as though there are, which means that when we make a decision, there's a confluence of a whole lot of different events that go into making that decision. Some of them are conscious, some of them are non-conscious, some of them have to do with knowledge, some of them have to do with the emotion. The other question that I'm very interested in, and the question I'm working on right now, has to do with the neurobiological basis or the neurobiological platform for moral behavior. What is it about our brain that makes us social? What is it about the mammalian brain that makes us not just care for ourselves and see to our own welfare, but to care for our offspring and to care for mates, for affiliates, kin, friends, and sometimes for strangers? And we're learning quite a lot about the chemicals that regulate those kinds of responses. So we know a piece or two of the story, and more will come into focus as the research proceeds. Well, I think one of the most interesting things about our social nature is that it appears to be mediated by several really very simple peptides, namely oxytocin and vasopressin. And of course, those are embedded within a vast network, a network involving the endogenous opiates, involving circuitry that relates brainstem structures to cortical structures and so forth. But it looks like the hub of the network is oxytocin. And that turns out to be a really important discovery because by changing levels of oxytocin, you can change sociality and how individuals interact with others. It's hard to know what kind of applications are going to come out of these discoveries, and that's partly because although oxytocin is at the hub of this network, it's an extraordinarily complicated network. But having said that, I think one place where there may actually be a significant intervention will have to do with autism spectrum disorder. Now, that's a very complicated disorder, and I know that people in Queen's Square have put a huge and very rewarding effort into studying autism. But it may also be that there is a story, not just at the genetic level, but at the level of the circuitry and how oxytocin figures in that circuitry. So it's conceivable, but this is just speculation. It's conceivable that some role for oxytocin might be found in order to ameliorate some of these symptoms.
What I really appreciate about Dr. Churchland's approach is that she's quite cautious with the information. This value of looking forward, what we anticipate could be uses of the information we're finding is huge. Other dilemmas that we find is that related to brain scans. If we return to brain scans again, what do they tell us about moral reasoning and whether or not somebody is really controlling their impulses? Is it possible to just basically blame your brain for something that you've done? It's not my fault, my brain is just simply immature. Can we use brain imaging for insanity defenses? And people have done this. Lawyers hold up brain scans and said, this is the brain scan of my client who killed this other person. But look at this, look how different it is from a normal brain. Is that fair? Is that correct? And there's more and more society meetings that are occurring related to moral decisions in the law or how we can change other people's minds. And lawyers are being really well trained in this area to use information to sort of lead and manipulate evidence that's presented. These are big questions related to neuroethics. Other questions that have been mentioned by some of the experts we've heard before, will these neural images of our brain change our understanding of free will and moral responsibility? In some of the neuromarketing techniques, you heard them say that some of these decisions are made by judgment calls and other things are really pushed by emotions. But at what stage does one take over from the other? And what does this mean for free will and moral responsibility? To get really more deeper into this idea of moral responsibility related to neuroethics, I want to share a problem with you, and I'd like to see how you would respond to the problem. I also listened to the take on this. What is the big decisive factor of whether or not somebody morally decides to do something or another?
I'm presenting a new argument, and there are many aspects of my argument that don't track consequentialism. One of the problems with consequentialism is that people don't think very imaginatively about what counts as a consequence. So you have the classic trolley problem that many of you have probably heard of. This is ubiquitous now in moral philosophy and in neuroscientific research on morality. You have a train coming down the track, and it's going to hit and kill 5 workmen who don't see it coming. But you stand at a switch, and you can throw the switch, and the train will take another track, and there it will only kill 1 workman. And so people are asked, should you flip that switch? Now, when asked this, 95% of people say, oh, absolutely, you have to flip that switch. You save a net 4 lives. You'd be a moral monster not to do that. But you can pose the problem another way. You now stand on a footbridge overlooking the trolley track. The trolley's coming down the track, and there's a suitably large person at your side who you can push into the path of the oncoming trolley, killing him, obviously, but saving a net 4 lives. And now, posed under this guise, 95% of people say you would be a monster to push that fat man onto the track. Now, I happen to think this is somewhat ill-posed because I think we all have an intuitive physics and we burn a fair amount of fuel wondering whether the fat man is really going to stop the trolley. But even if you finesse it and make it clear that he will, they seem different, these situations. Now, from the usual consequentialist point of view, people say, well, it's the same. You just have body count. This is actuarially, this is the same scenario. But maybe it is, in fact, not the same. If it is just fundamentally different to push a person up close and personal to his death than to flip a switch, if that difference can never be reformed, then they're not, in fact, the same. If you're going to wake up with nightmares for the rest of your life because you pushed someone, but feel like a hero because you flipped a switch, those are the consequences that have to be built into our analysis. And there are many ways in which the traditional discussion of these issues breaks down.
And if you further expand on the trolley problem, which many neuroethical researchers have done, you'll find that you are shown the video of the trolley. Many people, they have emotional responses to this. And this has a lot to do with, okay, my free will, I choose to do something. If I choose to kill someone to save other people, because it was your choice to do that, that carries a different emotional charge. There's a very different set of logical networks that are going on in your brain when you're making those big decisions. And so when you see this from a neuroethical perspective, you also get different responses, not just from a philosophical consequentialist view, what is the net gain or loss in this? Because humans are so emotionally charged, how is it that we can now track and see what types of choices they made based on the emotions connected to those decisions? So this makes emotions and morality much closer than they ever have been in the history of humanity. An additional dilemma that we have with neuroimaging is that predictive neuroimaging can either, make some people feel really good and happy. Oh, hi, you have a wonderful brain that looks really a lot like a gifted math brain. Or you can cause people to have, high stress throughout their lives, even showing them the same brain scan. So some people might take that information, oh, your brain looks like it's a highly gifted math brain, that's really terrific, to being totally stressed by that news. Oh, I have to live up to the potential of being highly gifted in math because my brain says that. Other types of information are that it's predictive. Gosh, your brain looks like, the brains of people who end up having schizophrenia. Or your brain looks like the type of brain that looks like it's bipolar or dyslexic. By predicting that, do you actually cause that to occur? And what are the consequences? Are people happy about that news because now they know? Or are they even more stressed? Becomes a vicious circle downward. So we don't know. This is another big dilemma. How much information do you keep or do you reveal to people whose brains are being scanned? So if we tell somebody, well, your brain really looks like somebody who's got a dyslexic brain or a depressive brain, or someone who's prone to Alzheimer's, or somebody who has good or bad executive functioning, or someone who is highly creative. These things exist now. We are now able to do experiments and they show these types of things. Does that help? What are the consequences of telling people that information? And what does that do to free will? This idea that you can be or do anything you want to. Now we're putting this parameter on saying, but guess what? Your brain doesn't really look like you can be and do anything you want to. You are going to have these limitations. And how does having that information actually create the limitation? Or could that person have, gotten over that limitation if they were ignorant of the fact that their brain tended to look something like? So these are huge neuroethical questions. One of the ethical dilemmas in Farah's book is really interesting. Is, will schools someday ask people to show up not only with your health certificate, but a couple of brain scans so that we can anticipate whether or not you look like you might have, X learning problem, and our, good intentions are to help you. But will that actually exclude you from certain situations? And one of the biggest neuroethical dilemmas, as we mentioned at the very start, has to do with the use of cognitive enhancers. We don't even know yet. Do the short-term benefits outweigh the long-term risks? This idea of nootropics drugs or neuroenhancement drugs, things that enhance cognition, or what was referred to in one of the videos as cosmetic neurology. What are all of the questions that surround those ideas? When we talk about this cosmetic neurology, there's a huge amount of questions, but most of them have been raised only in the past 10 or 15 years. What are smart drugs? Do they work? Are they ethical? Will they be legal? We don't know yet. We don't have those laws yet in many cases. So these are all questions for society to reflect upon. I'd like to throw out a parallel debate here. We have these nootropics and then you have cosmetic surgery. Well, part of the argument is, look, if you can afford it and it makes you feel better, why not do it, right? But what's the difference between that and then having drugs available? One of the speakers, Dr. Chatterjee, mentioned, is this going to exacerbate social differences between people who do have the money to invest in these cognitive enhancers versus people who can't? And the bigger question, should it even be legal even if you can afford it? Is that something that should be legal? Should you be able to tweak your brain in the same way that you can tweak your looks? To be better looking, can you just have better cognition because it's available to you? To look at some of these issues, let's look at Dr. Schneider's take on this.
And now for our next speaker is Susan Schneider, who is in the Department of Philosophy. And I think she will nicely take off from my talk and talk about some of the philosophical implications for these kinds of pharmacologic enhancements. Susan?
Thank you very much. Suppose it is 2025, and being a technophile, you purchase cognitive and physical enhancements as they become readily available. First, you add a mobile internet connection to your retina. Then, you enhance your working memory by adding more neural circuitry. You are now officially a cyborg. Now skip ahead to 2040. Through nanotechnological therapies and enhancements, you are able to extend your lifespan. And as the years progress, you continue to accumulate more far-reaching enhancements. By 2060, after several small but cumulatively profound alterations, you are a post-human. To quote philosopher Nick Bostrom, post-humans are possible future beings whose basic capacities so radically exceed those of present humans as to be no longer unambiguously human by our present standards. At this point, your intelligence is enhanced not just in terms of speed of mental processing. You are now able to make rich connections that you were not able to make before. Unenhanced humans, or naturals, seem to you to be intellectually disabled. You have little in common with them. But as a transhumanist, you are supportive of their right not to enhance. It is now 2400 AD, and for years, worldwide technological developments, including your own enhancements, have been facilitated by superintelligent AI. A superintelligence is a creature with the capacity to radically outperform the best human brains in practically every field, including scientific creativity, general wisdom, and social skills. Over time, the slow addition of better and better neural circuitry has resulted in there being no real intellectual difference in kind between you and superintelligent AI. The only real difference is one of origin. You were once a natural, but you are now almost entirely engineered by technology. You are perhaps more aptly characterized as a member of a rather heterogeneous class of AI life forms. So let me ask you, should you enhance, and why? Well, I have just given a very rough sketch of the kind of developmental trajectory that the transhumanist aspires to. Transhumanism is a philosophical, cultural, and political movement started by two philosophers, which holds that the human species is only now in a comparatively early phase and that its evolution will be altered by developing technologies. Transhumanists share the belief that an outcome in which humans have radically advanced intelligence, near immortality, deep friendships with AI creatures, and elective bodily characteristics is a very desirable end for one's own personal development and for the development of the species. Despite its science fiction-like flavor, the issues that transhumanism presents deserve to be taken very seriously. The beginning stages of this radical alteration are supposed to be the outcome of developments that are either here, if not generally available, or more commonly, technologies that are accepted by many in the relevant fields as being on their way.
So Dr. Schneider sums up, her video is much longer, but this idea is that there's a lot of things that are on their way, and things are about to change, and things are actually in process of changing, and we might not even be aware of it. Things that would make superior intellectual beings. This is on its way, and these are things that need to be discussed and debated for wider society's benefits, not just for neuroethics. So what are some of these dilemmas? Let's go back to this idea of cosmetic surgery versus cognitive enhancers. Will the limited availability or the cost of these drugs exacerbate social inequality? Just because you can do it and you have the money to do it, should you do it? And this goes to this original idea, remember out of Huxley's Brave New World book, in foreseeing the future, this idea of, do you raise children or do you design children? And what would be wrong with designing the greatest potential of an individual human? Or is there something really not ethical about doing that? I invite you to look at Stein and Chiesa, Hinton, and Fisher's article on this if you're interested. So some of the big questions coming out of this, how do you manage then pharmacological manipulation of attention, of memory, of mood? Is that really ethical? What are the consequences of knowing that you overcome some bout of depression or your attention problems thanks to drugs? Should we just be thankful for that, or are there other long-term consequences? Should there be better regulation from the Federal Drug Administration to monitor the use of these cognitive enhancers? And this question was actually addressed to, this was a big poll that was done with thousands of people trying to see, where are we at with this information? And surprisingly enough, it was found in 2008 that, most people still have not used neuroenhancers. For younger people, 25% of people 25 years of age have used some form of cognitive enhancement knowingly. 55 to 65-year-olds, people who move on into aging, this goes up again almost as high as the group as these young people who might be experimenting to see if they can focus better, work longer, stay in a better mood, stay on top of their game in a different way, thanks to pharmacological interventions. Other big questions are born of these things. We have a lot of research and we have aging communities, and we have a lot of new research that's occurring related to questions of Alzheimer's, to Parkinson's. But here's a big ethical question. Can somebody who's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, for example, give informed consent to have these drug trials done on them, or to have other types of interventions on them? Informed consent is really the cornerstone of what is bioethics. We must ask someone's permission before we do something to their body that might change their brains. This is why there's so much animal testing. You don't have to get consent from an animal, but you always need it for humans. These are other questions that come up. If we want to try to stave off the problems of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, can somebody who already has been diagnosed with that disease, can they actually give informed consent because that their mental capacity has been compromised by the disease itself? Other questions. What are the positive and what are the negative aspects of memory enhancement or repression? This question has really come up with returning veterans from war, people who've been in war situations. Should we be treating these people just by giving them drugs? Shall we just help them forget or alleviate post-traumatic stress disorders that they might be experiencing? Or should we continue on with typical therapies, do this in group therapy situations or individual therapeutic situations? Or should we, is it ethical to have them relive that experience? Is that something that's ethical? Facing the memory, is that always the best thing that you can do? Repressing the memory, is that always the best thing you can do? These are huge ethical questions that are pretty much on an individual level. But are there general societal parameters that we can work within? The final area that we want to look at has to do with this very big and very contentious field of law. Since we know that technology hasn't been perfected, but we know it's pretty accurate in doing things like detecting when an individual is lying. We know that lie detectors are no longer admissible, but could brain scans be admissible? So this huge area, of where science, where law, where policy, they begin to collide. And there's a lot of research occurring in this area. Is it ethical, though, to get into their heads and to figure out when they're lying and when they're not lying? Or is this just a part of human transactions that we have to just agree that we will continue to take people at their word? Or will it become the norm that nobody will go into a court situation without wearing one of these brain scanners so that we can actually see when they're deviating from their thinking about the questions, when they are actually trying to trick people into believing things that aren't true? And these things have huge consequences because it gives power to bodies that didn't have them before. What happens when you have court-ordered pharmacological interventions? And what extent does that actually violate an individual's human freedom and dignity? Many of you saw the movie of Alan Turing, in which at the end of the day, even though he brilliantly deciphered these codes that save, all of England and shortens the war and all the rest of this, that he was homosexual. And in those days, this is wrong and deviant social behavior. Therefore, we are going to pharmacologically castrate him. What did that do to the human, to the individual, to the self, by changing him in that way? Let's modify your brain because we don't accept your behavior. Is that correct? And who has the right to make those decisions? And should decisions only be made when they can last over time? If there is going to be beyond a reasonable doubt, okay. But we know that many people have been falsely imprisoned because of a false memory that somebody might have about an individual. That's incorrect. And so our legal system is fallible. It's humanly fallible. Humans make mistakes. This is a huge area, though, for decision-making related to legal activity. If we know our science isn't perfected yet, is it admissible to use this in courts that make decisions that have long-lasting implications that may or may not be correct in a decade or in 2 decades, or in 50 years, we might change our social norms, and so we would be incorrect in some decisions that were made, or were neuroethically correct in our moment right now, but maybe won't be in a few years' time. So to leave us with these last big implications about neuroethics, we have one last video to show you.
Hi, I'm Andrew Holtz, and today we're talking with Professor Hank Greeley from the Stanford University Law School. He's the Dean F. and Kate Edelman Johnson Professor of Law there. But we're not talking specifically just about the law, we're talking about medicine. As I said, you are a professor of law, yet you're looking a lot at the consequences of medical research. Why is that?
Because it's so interesting, because it's so important, I think, beyond just medicine. So for the last 20 years, I've worked on ethical, legal, and social issues in biosciences, genetics, neuroscience, stem cell research. We're doing lots and lots of research and learning amazing things driven by a medical compulsion, the desire to relieve human suffering. And yet, as we learn about some of the areas of the body, that our knowledge has consequences for the rest of society outside medicine. As we learn more about how human brains work for medical purposes, we also learn more about how human brains create human behaviors and how they might explain the behaviors, how we might be able to affect behaviors, and that's going to have huge consequences for all of our society.
What are some of the tools and the specific areas of medical research that are hot now that are bringing up some particular key issues involving neuroscience and the brain and law and ethics?
Well, I think the device that has really revolutionized this field more than anything else is the MRI machine, the magnetic resonance imaging machine, which allows us to get great images of soft tissue inside the body.
What are some of the main areas where you see cutting-edge research leading to probably some real important social and legal issues we're going to have to grapple with?
Yeah, I think there are at least 6 different categories of issues where neuroscience is likely to really have a substantial effect on our society and on our law. One is in making predictions about people, their future health and their future behaviors. A second is basically reading minds, being able to tell whether people are truly in pain, whether they're telling the truth or not, whether they feel bias or not. A third is issues of responsibility. Should we really hold somebody responsible for criminal behavior? Should we hold them responsible for making a contract? Should we decide whether he was competent to make a will? That we may be able to learn more about through neuroscience. There's a really fascinating issue involving consciousness and people in persistent vegetative states, people who've had serious brain damage. They seem to be unconscious, they're not responding to anything. There's some fascinating new research that shows some of those people may actually be conscious. Fifth, there are questions of treatment, not medical treatment. Medical treatment is certainly what's driving this research, but we might decide to treat people for behaviors we don't like. Criminal behaviors, deviant sexual behaviors, sexual predator behaviors, addictions, in some places political beliefs. A variety of different behaviors we might learn how to influence or treat through neuroscience. And finally, issues of enhancement, of using neuroscience to make healthy brains better than normal.
Again, you're an academic professor. Are these ivory tower kinds of things you can discuss at length, or are they hitting the courts in real life now?
Yes, they're both. I mean, there are ivory tower issues, and some of them I think will not be practical issues for 5, 10, 20 years, and may never be. Some of them are practical issues yesterday.
Give me examples of where some of this technology is actually hitting courts now.
So for example, the use of fMRI for lie detection is already creeping into society. There are 2 companies, one called CFOS, one with the wonderful name of No Lie MRI, that are selling lie detection services based on fMRI. I don't think we're ready for it yet. I don't think the evidence supports it. There is some evidence in support of it. But what's really interesting is these reports are already reaching the edge of the courtroom. People are trying to introduce them into evidence in court. There was very recently the first hearing that kept in a case in Brooklyn that kept such a lie detection report out. There's another one coming up very soon in Tennessee. I think more will follow. We don't have the luxury of time to study this for another 5 or 10 years before making our first decision. The decisions in some of these areas, like lie detection, need to be made today.
Mm-hmm. So these are questions involving ethical and legal questions that human society has wrestled with for millennia, and putting it in a new context with new questions because of this technology that's just emerging.
Yeah, I mean, we've always been mind readers. We've always tried to understand what other people are thinking. I'm trying to read your mind right now and see if you like how my answer is going, or you think I should change it, whether you're understanding me, whether you look confused. We read minds all the time, but we know we're not great at it, or poker wouldn't exist. Dating would look different. Life would be different if we were better at reading minds. Well, this technology gives us some possibilities to see what's going on inside people's heads and use that to make inferences about what they're thinking, feeling, believing, how they're going to act, and that is potentially revolutionary.
All right, Stanford University Law School Professor Hank Greeley, thanks very much for talking to me about how medical research can have very broad implications.
Oh, well, thanks, Andrew. It's always a pleasure.
Okay. I'm Andrew Holtz, MDITV.com.
So a great summary there. So with that in mind now, we just want to harken back to those first few slides where we talked about this intersection of all of these different fields, how these things will point to new decisions in society and how we manage neuroethics. And this goes back to this fundamental question, who decides? And I'd like to put this onto your plate now. I think you are a decision maker. We are all the decision makers in this. These are too big of issues to be left up to an individual person, to a public, to one country to lead over another country, because they do cross ethical boundaries, right? So the formal society is very important because these are experts who have a lot deeper insight maybe into some of these questions. But this is something that should and deserves societal debate, as Roski's paper points out. Okay, so with that on your plate, what did we try to do? We tried to define these terms. We also considered the historical development, and we looked at these issues in two big categories. Things that are neuropharmacological enhancers based on this cosmetic neurology, and the second category has to do with changes based on electrical impulses in the brain. So these are the two key ways that your brain can be manipulated or changed, or that we can document information in the brain. We also looked at the issue of using brain imagery without having a perfected technique, how dangerous that might be to pass judgment on individuals, and also the difficulties in doing correct brain scanning that was shared by Dr. Aguirre in the beginning when he mentioned that there are at least these 3 different ways of conducting brain imaging scans, and depending on how and what you do, you can really, it's like statistics, you can prove anything with numbers. Well, you could probably prove anything with neuroimaging at this stage because of the lack of perfection of that field. So these are some of the dilemmas that are in front of us right now that all of us need to consider. We shared some of those case studies, and so the last point is really, your role. What is your role in all of this? Now that you are empowered with some new information about neuroethics, what is right? What is wrong in your opinion? How can we err on the side of caution, as some of our speakers were mentioning, but at the same time, take the lead in making some decisions, because as the last speaker pointed out, there's just no more time to sit around and think about this from an academic standpoint. We do have to make some decisions because these things are reaching the courts, they are reaching the shopping malls. So these are things that need to be regulated sooner than later. So how can you add to this conversation? How can you add to this discussion? And how can we come to the best solutions, not only for ourselves individually, but for society as a whole? Okay, with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for joining me. So if you do have any questions in the interim, shoot me an email. I am looking forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.